And so just picking up where we last left off, looking at answer choice E, we're gonna break down this answer choice into the truth functional logic format. So if you study math, then you will do better in math as an adult. So if you want to do better in math, then you should study more math as a child. What's important to note is that doing better in math as an adulthood is different than wanting to do better in math as an adult. So that's where the two separate axioms as B and W respectively. And so what this ends up breaking down into if S then B, if W then S. And so in the end, looking at this question, though it's not perfect, you could definitely see the possible application of truth functional logic and how you can definitely see the comparison between the original question and answer choice A, which was the dandy horse one, and how they're very similar. Although this is applicable, it still suffers some problems with hard to model equations and questions. So the LSAT sort of applicable. Throughout the LSAT, we found questions not only like straight up applicable and not very applicable. We found questions that are iffy applicable, meaning that parts of truth functional logic can help you, but there are also parts that aren't very helpful at all. And for this question, looking at question 10, as you can see on screen currently, and so this is what's called an assumption question. And how truth functional logic can help us here is that it can help us model the question, model the argument, but as you'll see, truth functional logic is not applicable to help us in actually determining the answer choice. And so as I just mentioned before, it can help us model the question, help it break it down, but not answer. And so if we look at the original equation or question, hybrid technology will help us reduce our dependency on fossil fuels. If we invest in hybrid technology, we will reduce fossil fuels. If H, then R. It's important for us to cut down on fossil fuels, R. Therefore, we must invest in new hybrid technology, H. And so that's the original question modeled in truth functional logic. However, if you look at the answer choices, they're very different. What the question asks for is what assumption does the question pose? Or what assumption does that argument make? And as you can see from the answer choices, clearly truth functional logic is not helpful for us in this instant, as it cannot tell us, if the vehicles can be converted to hybrid technology. And so what this means is that truth functional logic can't handle a qualitative assumptions, or it's very binary in truth, false, valid, sound, and conclusive, that type of things. And now we're going to look at a question that's just straight up not applicable in terms of modeling the question and the answer choice. And so what you have right here is a question that asks for why employees said they preferred a specific scenario, in this case scenario 1. And this is known as a paradox question in LSAT terms. And so as I mentioned before, truth functional logic can neither help us model the question, the argument, nor can it help us answer it. And if you look at the answer choices, they're very kind of psychology or psychological questions, such as like employees of company X want their company to be more powerful or believe their personal welfare is not connected to the company's profit. And so this is why truth functional logic really comes to a problem on the LSAT, is that if it comes across a question that doesn't have an argument, only a sample scenario, then it just totally just blanks out. It's not able to help us to begin with. And furthermore, this type of question is what I call a gray question, or as I mentioned before, a qualitative question, which is this might be why it happened, or this might happen, that type of things. And so just looking at these examples, we can start to see some problems and limitation of truth functional logic, which we'll explore further in this side, which we kind of pull it all together. And so areas of logic truth functional logic really struggles with are degrees of uncertainty, passage of time, and obligation/permission, as well as non-binary possibilities. And so in the end, what this means is that for the most part on the LSAT, truth functional logic is not very applicable. As for the sort of applicable, we can see how sometimes it might be somewhat useful, as in it can help us model it, but oftentimes I feel it's more work than it's worth, and it's not intuitive, and since it won't actually help us answer the question, it's not very useful in that instance. However, in law itself, there do exist some uses for truth functional logic, which you will see in the following slide. And so this comes from a question on Onavac problem 46, and the premise is a actual Senate discussion turned discussion on the meaning of unless. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to label the original motion, see how people misinterpret and mutate it. And so what this really illustrates is that it shows the use of truth functional logic in discerning complex legal writings that are sometimes required to convey the correct ideas, and it also shows the folly of people who don't properly understand logic. And so here's the original question. It's quite a long block of text, but I've simplified it down to Mr. McClory moves to postpone for 10 days unless the president fails to give his assurance to produce tapes. Well, this is like the Nixon Watergate type of deal. And so if we model this in truth functional logic, it's actually quite straightforward and quite simple. P, postpone for 10 days. A, president gives his assurance to produce tapes. Looking at the original question, you have not A. If not A, then not P. And so this makes sense to us, but for the normal person, you can very easily misinterpret it. And it actually is quite confusing because in English, the wording is very strange to say the least. And so we'll see how people misinterpret this. Mr. Latta, which is a fellow senator, gets confused and proposes these proper interpretations. So if he fails tomorrow, we get 10 days. So if he doesn't give assurance, not A, then P, we get 10 days. And if he complies, he gives assurance A, we do not give him 10 days, then not P. So these two are his interpretation of the problem. He also has another further one which he suggests that you get 10 days providing the president gives his unequivocal assurance. If he gives assurance, then we get 10 days. And so although they are all intuitively correct, as seen by Mr. Latta's interpretation, they're all incorrect. And though A to P looks correct, it's actually not the proper wording, as we'll explain in the very last slide of this problem. Another person then chimes in and says his opinion that he finds the words fail to in Mr. McClory, as we put up top, need to be stricken. So Mr. McClory moves to postpone for 10 days unless the president gives his assurance to produce tapes. And so what this does is that if the president gives the assurance, then we'll move to postpone for 10 days. And this is also incorrect, as it does not match up to the original interpretation as the proper and correct one. And so finally, Mr. McClory finally decides to reword his proposal to kind of help clear up the confusion, which doesn't really help in my opinion, but we'll see. And so what he says is that it provides for postponement of 10 days unless the president fails tomorrow to give his assurance. And we can definitely break that down to if the president fails to give his assurance, then there will not be postponement for 10 days, if not A, then not P. So there is not a postponement if the president fails to give his assurance. Once again, if not A, then not P. Just going through, there is a 10-day postponement unless the president fails to give his assurance, the exact same. And if he fails to give, there is only a 24-hour delay, the exact same once again. So Mr. McClory just rewords his proposal 4 times in different combinations of English words. And so the present wording is the only correct wording. And I think that's very clear. And although A to P may seem correct, if the president gives assurance, then we will postpone, the order of which is incorrect, as in what happens if the president doesn't assure. So the only correct wording is if not A, then not P, which is if he doesn't give his assurance, then we won't postpone. Of course, the contrapositive of that is also correct. So if we postpone, then he will give assurance, but of course that's not sound in real life, as the order is also incorrect for that one. But this discussion of the Senate just goes to show the real-life applications and importance of logic, how the intuitive or the layman interpretation of logic, as represented by Mr. Latta and Mr. Mann, is simplistic and incorrect fundamentally. And the numerous wordings of Mr. McClory just show how flexible truth functional logic can be in English, and how if you don't have a proper grasp of the rules and the symbolic representations, then you really will have a hard time understanding and conveying the right idea.
All right. So we've seen that the truth functional logic has many limitations and also many strengths in evaluating an argument, but it still is inadequate when we consider an example like this. If we use military force, we'll endanger the lives of the hostages. So if putting the hostages' lives in danger is unacceptable, we shouldn't use force. So truth functional logic can't really handle these quote gray connectives. Like maybe or should or acceptable or permissible, which is why we can introduce kind of a new form or add on to truth functional logic, and add deontic connectives that kind of cover some of these flaws and allow us to evaluate moral arguments and legal arguments in kind of a different context. So really the first, I guess the central notion of deontic logic is obligation. So there are many different kinds of obligation, as I said before, moral, legal, and practical. For example, John should drop out of school is kind of more general, and John is obligated to drop out of school is a little bit more forceful. So whether an obligation is modal, meaning that it's either true or false, like it's impossible to do otherwise, or deontic, really relies on context. So obligation is clearly not truth functional. Whether something is or isn't doesn't tell you about whether it should be so. So if the state just raised taxes, you can't determine whether it should or it shouldn't have. And so this leads us to the concept of permissibility. So just like obligation, there are different types, moral, legal, and practical, different kinds of permissibility. So it's permissible for Susan to elope, or Susan can elope. So like relating the two, permissibility can be defined in terms of obligation. So if we consider this example, if it's okay for Fred to bring his brother, then it's not true he is obligated to leave his brother at home. So we can translate it to if A is permissible if and only if you are not obligated to not do A, which is what we can see in this example with Fred and his brother. So in kind of a culmination of obligation and permissibility, we can see forbiddance. So it is wrong for you to kill, kind of a moral obligation. But these are both forbidden. But so it's wrong for you to kill, or you are forbidden to kill. There's kind of a difference between the moral and legal kind of stances there. In forbiddance, its equivalence to permission or obligation. If you're not permitted to act, or you're obligated not to act, those are different. Those are both different ways of expressing forbiddance. So generally, certain words can carry modal or deontic meanings. So can, may, or must. And these kind of, as we've said, these make up for flaws in truth functional logic, but they can also vary in significance. So you should not commit murder. You should not pass on the right. What should I do? These are all examples of different interpretations based on the context of the sentence. So for the validity of an argument, this interpretation doesn't matter as long as it's consistent. But for the in evaluating the soundness of an argument, it does matter.